We all know our GDP was more than 33% of the world's GDP, at least, maybe more. But what about our per capita GDP? Do you think that was a boastful number too, given how this land has always had a huge population? Interesting question. So, India, see, if you look at the statistics, the data that Angus Madison, the economist, put forth, you will see that according to his calculations, projections, which is the gold standard in the economic history of the world, according to his calculations, India always had a GDP of at least one third of the world's GDP until the 1700s, at which time our GDP dropped very precipitously because of the British destruction of India's economy and the country. Now, India's population, if we look at the population of history of India, India's population was typically, when the British left India, undivided India had a population of approximately between 300 and 350 million, which is, if it was 300 million, it is one fourth of what India's population is today, right? And if you look at the large scale history of India, so let's go back a few thousand years. If we go back about to around 3000 BC or 3500 BC, we had the Sapta Sindhu phase of India's civilization, the Saraswati Sindhu phase of India's civilization, with the which the Western people call the Indus Valley civilization or the Harappan civilization, which is nothing but one phase of India's civilization. So if you go back to that time, India was demonstrably demonstrably the most technologically advanced culture in the world, a fully industrialized, fully urbanized civilization with the highest technology available at that time anywhere in the world. And at that time, I can guarantee that India's GDP would have exceeded half the world's GDP. And at that time, it is estimated that India's population was around 5 million. 5 million. Not 300 million, not 1.4 billion, which we are reaching today. It was merely 5 million. So, more than half the world's GDP for 5 million people. Can you imagine the per capita GDP which we would have had? So, we have to put things in perspective. This is a very interesting question. I mean, I wish that people would think more along these lines. So, we have to look at what the population was like from the best estimates that historians and scholars have. So, the best estimate for India's population uh, during the Saraswati Sindhu phase was about 5 million people. And India's GDP was more than 50% of the world's GDP for sure. Maybe two-thirds of the world's GDP, because that's how advanced India was. So the per capita GDP would have been ridiculously high, more than any other country even today. So these are not boastful numbers. The numbers are actually underrepresentations of what India would actually be, India's GDP would actually be. Because even if you look at the data that Angus Madison has put forth, there are a number of assumptions and oversimplifications that are not quite accurate when it comes to India. So even the data for the last 2000 years, which says that India was about one third of the world's GDP, is kind of an underrepresentation of what it actually would have been. Even in the last 2000 years, the actual data, the actual GDP of India would have been closer to, I would say, 40 to 45% of the entire world's GDP, most likely, more likely. So that's what I can offer. But in the past, uh, before 0 AD or 0 BC, whatever you call it, India's economy was even more advanced, and the per capita GDP would have been really, really high.